Today we're talking about books. In 2022 I read a total of 24 books, which I'm pretty proud of because I set a reading challenge of 12 books at the start of the year and I've doubled that. And today I'm just going to go through the list of all the books that I've read using Goodreads. Like, thank God Goodreads exists. It has really helped me, otherwise I'd completely have forgotten all the books that I read. I'm going to go through each of the books, talk really briefly about it and just say whether I liked it or not, basically, and then at the end maybe I'll do a top 5. We'll see. Okay, the first book I read this year was The Hobbit. I felt like starting off the year with a fantasy book, with a book that I knew that I would like, because I adore fantasy and you do really get transported. I love it. I don't think it's a children's book. I know like people like, I know he wrote it as a children's book, children's style, but maybe I just like children's book because my favourite book is The Little Prince and that's pretty much a kid's book, but I don't know. Next one was A Doll's House. I really enjoyed it. It's revolutionary for the time. It was written in the 1800s and it talks about how a woman who is in a very stereotypical role, she's very infantilized, like she's talked to like she's a doll, like she's a little girl, and she's kind of like passed down from her father to her husband. It basically talks about how she liberates herself and how she goes against society norms. Yeah, I liked it. It's a quick read. It's a quick, nice little, I like plays because I feel like they're very easy and quick to read. Okay, next is, oh my god, this is probably one of my favorite, this is definitely in the top 5 of the best books that I've read this year, is The Picture of Dorian Gray. I've always really wanted to read an Oscar Wilde book because I was curious, and honestly I really enjoyed The Picture of Dorian Gray. I mean, a lot of you will have probably read it. It's basically about how a man wishes that instead of him getting old, this painting gets old and he conserves that like eternal beauty. And basically as this man gets more and more morally corrupt, the painting becomes uglier and uglier, and oh, it's so good. It basically just talks a lot about narcissism, about identity, about what is beauty, about corruption, about your soul. It's very philosophical and I love those kind of books that make you think. If you want to think, read Oscar Wilde, because like literally every sentence you'll be thinking full stop. Every sentence, every passage, there's some really beautiful quotes in there. I recommend. Oh, okay, I actually think this one for me is definitely top 5 as well. I was in an airport and I like mythology and I passed this book on Norse mythology and I was like, oh, that sounds like a nice airport read, and read it and it was such an easy read. Like if you're not into reading and you need like short stories that are quick and simple and easy to read and that are just to the point, like I recommend this. It's so good. I didn't realise that all these superheroes from like Marvel, etc., like Thor and Loki, they're all derived from Norse mythology. Like they're all stolen from Norse mythology. They're literally just taken, which just shows how, I don't know, I found it really interesting. Like Norse mythology is full of like blood and guts and gore, kind of like Greek mythology, but I love it. I adore it. I like fantasy and the book is just so easy to read. I found it really enjoyable. Okay, next is The Girl with the Pearl Earring. This is probably one of the books that I didn't like this year. I found the main character quite annoying. Like, yeah, it's about Rembrandt and like it paints the era well, like you get a good idea of what it was like to live in that era, but I don't know, I didn't really like it. I found it quite boring. Like it was like a love story but nothing happens and I just find those frustrating. Like also it wasn't really a love story because I just didn't feel the chemistry between them. Fahrenheit 451, I really enjoyed this. I like dystopian fiction. I like Brave New World. I like 1984. I like Handmaid's Tale was hard to read, but I liked it overall. Like some of these books, like they're a bit hard to get through, but then once you've read them, you're like, oh, I'm happy I read that. But Fahrenheit 451, I remember it was super easy to read. I recommend it. It's basically a world where books have to be burnt. So firefighters, instead of putting out fires, they start fires to burn books, basically to burn all knowledge. And it's told, the story is told from the point of view of a firefighter who has to burn books. So I find it a very interesting idea. And then obviously you can go into like a whole massive depth of analysis with it. Like it's a good book to get you thinking. So that's the end of my like general literature section. Next section is self-help books / non-fiction books. I haven't even read that many self-help books this year. I feel like I adore self-help books and non-fiction books. I really do. I just find them so motivating. Like I kind of want to read some more next year. How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. It's a good read. I feel like people should read it, but I don't want to sound It's basically a self-help book which tells you how to act around people, how to be likable, etc. I don't know, I don't want to sound like that person, but I did know quite a lot of what he was saying in the book. I was like, yeah, I kind of know that just from having already interacted with people. Like, I think I'm generally quite good with people and new people. Like, I'm not saying I'm amazing, but I think a lot of what's written in the book I was like, that's kind of common sense, but that's just my take on it. I do think it's a good read anyway, especially when it talks about, there's a section which talks about like how to write emails and stuff, and I'm so bad at writing emails, so I think it's useful. Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, amazing, really good. It's a thick, chunky book. I personally especially really liked the first section of it. Like, the first section talks about how the human race basically started, and like anthropology goes into all that kind of like how societies were built. I really liked the first section. I kind of like the other sections were good as well, but my favorite is the first section. So even if you just read the first section, I do think it's worth a read. I do love a non-fiction book. I feel like I should read more non-fiction books this year. Next is Jonathan Livingston Seagull. It's a tiny book with images. It's really cute. Like, it's a nice little moral story. I think it's a very easy read. It's similar to like The Alchemist or The Little Prince, but like, it's not like my favorite. I mean, I love little philosophical moral stories, but it's not like one of my favorites. Like, it hasn't stuck in my head that much. The Little Prince, however, is, I mean, that's like my favorite book, I would say, or like one of my favorite books. It's not on the same level, but it's a nice little moral story. Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, I do recommend it. It talks about what differentiates, what makes someone stand out, like what makes somebody that much more successful than like everybody else. The Slight Edge was recommended to me by a teacher when I was in secondary school. I'm pretty sure I had like a breakdown in biology, and he was like, Eloise, just read this book, it could help you out. But I never ended up reading it until this year, and it's good. It's like, I feel like all these self-help books, when it comes to like how to be better, how to achieve like your true potential, they always drill down to habits and making habits and building a good system. Outliers, The Slight Edge, Atomic Habits, that all kind of have a similar message, but it's good to be reminded of it, and like it's good to read it in different ways, because then maybe it will go in more. And then finally, another non-fiction book I read was on Palestine. This summer in June I went and visited my friend in Jordan, because he was doing a year abroad there, and Jordan is home to so many refugees, especially Palestinian refugees, and so I decided, because I really didn't know that much about the situation, I decided to read a book on it. And on Palestine, it's like, it does explain it quite well. Okay, now onto my language books. We'll start with French. Candide by Voltaire. Why? Because it's like a little book. It's not necessarily about the difficulty of the language. A lot of the time it's about like the length of the book. Like, the fatter the book, the harder it is to get through, whereas Candide is like short, sweet, another like funny little moral story. So I quite liked Candide. It's basically, so I'm not really explaining these books. If you like book recommendations, then I will make other videos on where I go more into depth on books that I recommend reading. But for today, I'm just drilling through them. Okay, I have just had to go inside because of the construction work, which is really annoying. Okay, where was I? I'm gonna have to shut the window as well. Madre mia! Allora, Fille by Camille Laurence. I'll try and do another video where I go more into depth. I genuinely will try and do another video where I go into depth, but I quite enjoyed it. I just remember there being a lot of quotes where I was like, oh my god, that is literally what it is to be a girl. It just talks about how, like, as a girl, talks about a girl who was born into a family that wanted a boy, and just how girls, it shows like real life examples of how girls are just treated differently in the world. I think it was like, I did quite enjoy it. I read 2 books by Romain Gary. Firstly, La Vie Devant Soi, which is up there with one of my favorite books. I really enjoyed it. The family I babysat for gave it to me as a present, and genuinely such a good book. It talks about a orphan boy who's the son of a prostitute, how he's looked after by this ex-prostitute herself and ex-Auschwitz survivor, and it just talks about like the love of like a son towards a mother, and how this boy literally does everything to look after this woman, his mother. It's really touching, and it's set in Paris. Through this little boy, he meets all these different characters of all the people who live in his quartier, which is in the 20th, so a quartier that isn't like the rich area of Paris. After La Vie de Bonsoir, because I enjoyed it so much, I read La Promesse de l'Aube. It's basically an autobiography of the author Romain Gary. Like, it was a good book, but I didn't enjoy it as much as La Vie de Bonsoir. I'd definitely recommend La Vie de Bonsoir before La Promesse de l'Aube. But it was just interesting reading about the author. I always find it really interesting to read about the author after you've read a book, and Romain Gary is a very interesting man, or was a very interesting man. And this isn't fiction, but I read La Chambre Claire by Roland Barthes, who is a very respected French philosopher. And La Chambre Claire, it was a book that I had to read for my photography, my history of photography class. It's kind of like, I don't know, it talks about photography in a way that you just start staring into the sky and being like, why do I take pictures? It makes you think about photography a bit more, and just how like crazy photography is. And he says things like, a photograph is a snapshot of death, because you're looking into, like, when you're taking a photograph and you're looking at a photograph, you're looking at death. Things like that, because it's, you know that the person who's on the photograph has lived and will die, and just things like that. Like, I had to do an exam on it as well. Interesting, but it will make you question a lot of things. Existentialisme et un humanisme. I would give that a 5/5. I liked that book a lot. It's like, I do not have the time to go into existentialism, but it's an interesting book, and it's very short, and if you're interested in Sartre's ideas, it's like the perfect one to start with. Like, it's the perfect book because it's very short and just kind of says his ideas very clearly. Now onto my Spanish books. I feel like I've been speaking for ages. Okay, onto my Spanish books. El Lazarillo de Tormes was the first one I read this year. Was not a massive fan. I mean, it was written, like, when was it written? These are ones that I had to read for university, and people are always like, oh, do you have any Spanish book recommendations? And I just don't like the books that they set me to read at university, and I only have time to read those. Yeah, it was written in 1554, so I should remember that from my exam, but was not a massive fan of Lazarillo de Tormes, honestly. Picaresco novel, what's that in English? Basically talks about a little delinquent boy and his little adventures, but it was just really hard to read. It's like old Spanish. I read by Juan Rulfo, Pedro Páramo and El Llano en Llamas. I really enjoyed both, actually. Like, not really enjoyed. I found they were both quite hard to read, but in terms of analysing them, they were really interesting. I preferred El Llano en Llamas to Pedro Páramo. Pedro Páramo talks about how this man who goes in quest to find his father and ends up in a ghost town, basically. And then he finds out about the whole history of the village and why it turns into a ghost town, etc. Interesting to analyse, like so interesting to analyse. I mean, the man who wrote them was a genius. El Llano en Llamas is similar. It's like lots of little short stories, lots of little short cuentos, stories, cuento, ¿qué es un cuento? Bref, I really liked El Llano en Llamas because some of them were, once again, they're just, when you're like reading them and then going into class and analysing them, it's really enjoyable, but I wouldn't recommend it as like a leisurely book to just read through. I think you have to analyse them to like appreciate the genius behind it. Nada de Carmen Laforet, another one that I had to read. It's about a girl who post-Civil War moves to Barcelona. It's just quite a depressing book, as you can probably tell by the title Nada, which means nothing. There's a lot of like domestic abuse, talks about how hopeless people were after the war. It's interesting if you want to get a picture of what it was like in Spain after the Civil War, but like once again, it's like not the most interesting story. París no se acaba nunca. I half enjoyed this book, half didn't. Like I half enjoyed it because it talks about Paris. It talks about the author who lived in Paris, and he talks about how he wanted to be this like big writer, and he goes to Paris with all these big dreams, and then the reality was quite different. It's interesting, especially because I can relate it to Paris, but it wasn't like my favorite style of writing. Same with Paseos con mi madre. These are both very contemporary, like very recent books, and Paseos con mi madre also talks about how this man goes back to Barcelona and he's walking through the streets of his old town. He recounts like stories. Both books are meant to be kind of autobiographical, but I don't know, I wouldn't really recommend either. Like they're both, I think you can always find things in books that you appreciate, that you respect, but they're not like my favorite books either. I wouldn't recommend them. I need to read more Spanish books that I enjoy. But yeah, that was it. That's like a little quick, very rushed, not rushed, but that's a quick run through all the books that I've read this year. Let me know if you've got any recommendations. Let me know if you've read the books, because I like talking about books. I'm sending lots of love to everyone, and I will see you in 2023. Bisous.